Hello and welcome. My name is Walid Meh. I am a Microsoft Technical Trainer here to walk through the Microsoft SC-300 Identity and Access Administrator Associate course with you. Think about this. Your organization's data is everywhere on laptops, mobile phones, cloud apps, and remote servers. How do you make sure only the right people get access at the right time from the right place? That's where the conditional access comes in. In this session, you'll discover how conditional access lets you set smart policies that adapt to risk, location, device, and user behavior automatically, blocking threats and granting access only when it's truly safe. Get ready to see how you can turn identity into the strongest security shield. Let's get started. Now, before we start setting up into conditional access, let's talk about some security details that we already have configured in our Entra. Now, if you're starting fresh with Entra and looking into configure security details, by default, Entra already comes with what we refer as security defaults. Now, these security defaults are there in place to ensure that as soon as your Entra starts working, it has some sort of security measures in place, just to protect any password spray attacks or any other similar attacks that could be out there to avoid malicious actors from gaining access to your environment. Now, if you are looking to implement better security measures, it's recommended that you move away from the security defaults and start using conditional access policies in your environment. Now, let's jump into the portal first and find out where we can see security defaults before we begin. And then we'll move into looking at conditional access from there. Right, I'm back into my portal, which is entra.microsoft.com, my Entra Admin Center. And within the portal, if I simply look at the properties under the Overview tab for Entra and scroll down to the bottom of the screen, this is where I can see my security default settings that are available for me to work with. Now, my security default typically would be enabled if I wasn't using any other method of security like conditional access. Now, in my case, I have already enabled my conditional access to manage my security in my environment, so I don't have the option anymore to disable security defaults. However, if you are looking to implement conditional access, you must disable your security defaults. Otherwise, the conditional access policies are not efficient, simply because the security default will keep on asking people to do MFA at different stages, which might not be recommended if you're using conditional access policies. Now, let's move into talking about what is conditional access and how we configure it. All right, before we go into the details of how to configure conditional access, let's first understand how conditional access actually works. First of all, let's understand conditional access. This is where I tend to explain the topic of these policies as if and then statements. Now, again, this is mere just for the explanation to understand if and what should happen then. And this is where we can start looking at what does the system looks at to consider the statement of what is happening right now, looking at if, and then based on those, it can come up with a decision of then it should take certain actions. By default, the conditional access policies are picking up a lot of the signals that are coming into your environment. And these signals can be generated by the user based on their authentication methods. They can also be based on the location that user is on. It can look at device health, and other details around the device. It can look at the applications that they're logging into or working with. It can also work with the risk attached to your users, which can be done in real time. Now, let's take a quick example to understand this. Imagine me currently sitting in my office working onto my resources in Azure, for example. Now, the signals that I might be generating would be all the details around me as a user, my user login details, and maybe the location that it's picking up from where I am right now. And let's assume I'm sitting in the office and I'm connecting to my resources. Now, the signals might be suggesting that, hey, Walid is trying to access this data that's sitting somewhere across on our cloud resources, and Walid is using the work laptop, and Walid is logging in from the office location. Now, based on some of this, I might define a policy that suggests if that is the case, if this is the condition that we're coming up with, then allow Walid access. That's all secure. Walid is in a secure environment on a work device that's allowed, and Walid should be able to work. Now let's assume it's gone past 5, I've left my office, I'm on my way home, and I get a call from my manager. And the manager suggests, hey Walid, by the way, I have the changes that we've made today, well, we don't want to push them out right now. Can you revert them back and we'll push them out tomorrow? And I'm telling my manager, I'm on my way home, so I'll be able to do this when I get home, and I'll make those changes back. Now, in this case, when I get home, I log in again. This is me logging back in, so the user details stay the same. However, in this case, my location might change simply because I am no longer in my office building, away from that. Ideally, the location might still be within the same country, unless I've taken a flight somewhere else. So I'm not far from my original location, and the device I'm using, maybe I'm still working on my work laptop, or maybe I'm doing it from my personal laptop or a mobile phone. So some of these signals may change. Now, based on that, the signals that are coming into the conditional access policy, it could look at that and say, all right, some things are same, other things are not so same. Maybe let's ask this user to verify it's actually them and not somebody else trying to pretend to be them. And we can then ask the policy here to force the user to go through multi-factor authentication. So we're introducing another layer of security at that point, just to make sure this is the actual user. Now, let's assume that I have traveled abroad and I have gone to, say, a complete different country. Let's say we've traveled to a country that doesn't actually come under the same compliance region to where I am. So imagine I was working in Europe and now I've traveled to US. Now, in that case, what could happen is my user details are same, so still me working onto my resources. The location that I have now is completely different, maybe outside of the compliance of the region that my initial location was. The device I'm using, still same. I'm carrying my work laptop with me and I'm traveling abroad. Now, when I try to access this data, the conditional access policy at that point could see, hey, this user is coming from outside of the region that's required for the person to be compliant to be able to work on this data. Now, it could simply block my access because of some of those constraints that I should have based on moving different regions, and it might block my access. Now, this is where the conditional access becomes very, very interesting, that based on my authentication methods, using multi-factor authentication and all other security layers that I could have, it can still come up with decisions to decide if any of the signals that I'm generating, are they still allowed, or should they be allowed for me to be able to gain access to my resources, or should they be stopped? So we can add these additional layers thanks to conditional access. Now, let's jump onto the portal and have a look at how the conditional access policies look like. I'm back into my portal, looking at Entra Admin Center at entra.microsoft.com. Now, if I scroll down to the blade of my Entra portal, I can see the conditional access right there. And just at a quick glance, we can see at an overview some of the policies that I've implemented, some enabled, some for report only, and none are off. But we'll get back to some of those details a bit later on. You can see some other details on the overview tab if you wanted to understand how well some of the policies are doing. But for us, we're jumping straight into the policies to begin. Now, there are some policies that are already there. I'll leave them out for just now, and we can jump on to looking at creating a new policy for this part of the demo. Now, under the new policies, there are a few different sections that we can look at, and this is where it tells me on what we are going to do in terms of creating my policies. Now, just to break this down, if we look at the two different parts that are listed over here, one called the assignment, and the second part that's called the access control. Now, again, if you were following through the explanation that I did earlier, consider this as your if part and the second part over here as the then part. So if any of those above conditions match or the signals match, then what should the conditional access policy do in your environment? So you define them at two different parts. Now we'll start with the first one. Under assignments, I have a few different tabs. We'll touch on some of these just to kind of get a gist of what these things are. The very first one says, hey, go and assign where this policy applies or who this policy applies to by looking at users and groups. Now, by all means, I can select all users and apply this policy to everyone in my organization. However, something very important to bear in mind is that we want to make sure we don't lock ourselves out. And this is where the system keeps on warning you, where you choose policies that applies to entire directory in your environment. So you want to be careful with that. You don't want to lock yourself out. For instance, creating a policy that says block people from accessing in certain scenario, and you're adding yourself to it as well, and then you get blocked out and you can't log back in. So be very careful when you're designing these policies in terms of creating these. Typically, you'll have certain accounts that you might want to exclude from a majority of your policies. We refer to them as break glass accounts. Again, we'll come back to that at a later stage. But you could choose to create a policy for a certain team, certain group, certain departments, and might not be applying the policy to everyone. Now, nice thing about this is if I go into choosing selected users and groups, I have a very nice option to choose a policy straight to my entire guest and external community. So I can go and choose who am I applying this policy to. Maybe I create different policies for guests or external users when they come in. Maybe they're required to go through extra hoops of security before they get access to the resources as compared to the member users when they're working in the organization or within the office. So again, that could be something possible. I could create a policy for roles. This could be particular admin type roles that I might have. Maybe for application administrators, I require them to do certain specific. Maybe for certain admins, they might be in a particular location to be able to perform those changes. So I could apply a conditional access policy based on a role. Again, an option that we can pick and choose. Apart from that, we could go into looking directly into users and groups and start assigning policies to individual user, multiple users, or simply adding a group of users in here to assign a policy for them. Now, we can do this for many different situations or solutions. However, just for today, we are going to pick on Frank, our key user that we've been working on in the series, and we'll apply this policy just for Frank. All right. Now, again, by all means, in typical scenarios, you will create multiple policies in your organizations rather than creating one policy that fits everything. So bear that in mind. In this explanation, in this demo, I am going to be touching on quite a few different sections, which typically would cover as separate policies in normal scenarios. So please bear that in mind. So we're picking one user and we're not excluding anyone out. However, if I wanted to, I could exclude people from this policy as well. But I'm only adding one person. So that's the first tab. The next option I have over here, it says target resources. Now, based on target resources, I can actually target a particular resource that I might want this policy to work for. Now, I don't have to, but I can. I can choose any resources that are coming from internet resources with global secure access. If I have implemented that, then any internet-based resources coming through that, this policy could be for them. I could go into all resources right over here and choose out that this policy applies to every single resource that's part of my Entra setup. And it could apply to every single thing that is in here. Again, it warns me, just don't block yourself out, because that would mean me accessing anything in my environment, including the portal where we are configuring some of these changes. Or I could go into selected resources. And here is where I can go into, say, selects and choose a particular resource type. Now, I might say this is for the Microsoft admin portals. This is all my admin portals, including Entra, including admin.microsoft.com, including security portals. So I could apply this to all of that, saying whenever you go into any of these portals, maybe I like you to do MFA or something else that I might add into some of the parts of the policies in a minute. Or I could just say, hey, when you're logging into your Office applications, maybe I require you to do something different. So again, you can choose different resources right now in terms of where you want to control people's access. Now, along with that, just above my selecting option, I have an option over here. Oh, apologies. Let's agree to that first. Let's apply this to office.com. Now, apart from that, I have an option over here to go and filter. Now, if you have been watching this series, one of the session that we covered earlier on in this series was to do with security or custom security attributes. Now, if I require someone to have a particular level of clearance or particular benefit package or sales package or whatever that you're configuring in as part of security attributes, we want that user to have that particular value added to their profile before they can access that resource. This is where you could go and bring that into your conversation. So you can simply click on yes to this, and you can start adding expressions in here to define if this user profile has that particular security attribute. In that case, allow them access. Now, as a very quick example to that, I can simply say, hey, well, let's choose a security clearance level for this user. And if that is equal to, let's say, level 2, then this user should be able to gain access to that resource. So again, this is a way that we can bring in custom security attributes as part of your policy as well. Now, I'll leave this out for now. We'll switch it off and we'll come back out of it. It's good to know where you can bring in some of these settings that you have in your course. So we'll leave it as Frank for now, trying to access Office 365 portal. And that's so far what we've gathered from the policy that we've configured. Now, the next part that I have here is called the Network tab. Now, under the Network tab, I can choose, again, all these options are not necessarily, they shouldn't necessarily be configured all the time. You can pick and choose what suits your need when you're creating a policy. Like I said, you might create multiple policies for different scenarios. In this demo, we're covering all of them, just for the conversation. Now, if I switch this on, I could suggest any network or location. So if Frank logs into office.com, no matter from where, this policy applies to Frank. Or I could say, hey, do we allow Frank to log into office.com as long as Frank is on a trusted network location? We have this policy for Frank. Or I could go in to say, hey, selected network and locations. And this is where it's going to bring me a list of selected networks that I have in my setup that I will show you a bit later on, where I can add more locations if I needed to. They can be listed over here. Now, this could also be that if Frank is on these locations, maybe Frank needs to do something extra, maybe an MFA. Or if Frank is on these locations, maybe Frank is okay and he doesn't need to go through any of that. So you define the policy on how it works for you best. So we have an option over here to suggest the location. Now, for this particular demo, we'll leave it on all locations. So no matter where Frank is logging into office.com, Frank, this policy will apply to you. All right, now, the last tab we have under the assignments is called conditions. Now, there are quite a few different conditions available in here to look at. Again, these conditions will work with loads of different other security solutions that we have in Entra. We're not going to be configuring all of them today. Just to at a quick high level understanding of these, we can look at if this user has any user risk associated to them, and we can go and configure that if Frank's logging into office.com from anywhere and Frank's user account has a risk of low, medium, or high, then this policy applies to you, Frank. Again, based on some of these conditions, we can still define what should happen, then part. We haven't yet got to that yet. So that's one part. Again, similar other options that we have in here. We have sign-in risks. We can suggest if there were any sign-in risks, assuming that the current sign-in that someone is doing using Frank's profile to Office. And if there is a risk associated to it, then maybe Frank needs to take a couple of other steps. Similarly, we have other options, things like insider risks that we can look at. So if there is an insider risk based on Frank's profile and Frank is logged into office.com, maybe we want to do something else or block the access. Further down on the conditions, we have other things. Things like, let's say okay to that. We don't want to configure it. Looking at different device platforms, this is where I can define. If Frank is logging in from Windows, then it's okay. However, if Frank is logging in from a Mac OS or iOS or Android, maybe Frank is on a mobile device or a personal device, maybe I want to configure a different set of policies for when that happens. So I have that choice under conditions using device platforms. Further down, I still have an option over here that adds itself as location. However, this has been moved out over here to the networks, so we don't need to configure that again. This is something that in recent changes, the location has moved out under the location, under the networking heading on the main blade. So we'll leave that out. Apart from that, we have other options that we can look at, such as looking at the client applications. So if Frank is using maybe a browser or a mobile app and a desktop client, then this policy could apply to Frank. So we have some of those options to add into this as well. We could also look at filtering through the device. This is where I can create a policy to filter device. Again, this is going to use me defining a syntax rule to suggest if the device has maybe a particular name, is registered, is joined to my Entra, belongs to a department, or whatever device settings or properties that I can pick from, I can come in here and start defining them and suggest only if Frank is on that particular device, then this policy applies to Frank. Or if they're not on that device and they're using another, then maybe they need to do something else. And finally, the last option that I have here is looking at authentication flows. And this is something that I can define in here. If there was a need for me to define an authentication flow for this user, I can come in here and configure some of that for that. Now, apart from looking at all the conditions, like I said, just bear in mind, you're never going to configure all of these options in one policy. Very likely, you're going to configure a few of them. Otherwise, you'll create multiple policies to configure some of these options that we've just covered. Now, let's assume so far we've got Frank trying to log into office.com, and the condition so far we've dropped in is just the network, the network location. So Frank's coming in from any location, logging in, then this policy applies to Frank at the moment. Now, we don't have any other setting configured so far. So what should happen to Frank? And this is the second part of the conditional access policy when we're looking at the then part. Under the access control, the very first tab I have is grant. Now, the easy thing we can do is say block. So if Frank logs in from any part of the network and logs into office.com, we can block access. This is where we can start changing things. We can say, hey, we don't necessarily want to block Frank from logging in. We want to grant Frank access to this. However, we might need to bring in some other options to control this grant permission. We could say allow access, but maybe we'll require the user to go through multi-factor authentication. Now, this is dependent on if I need the user to verify it's actually them. Now, this could work very nicely if I had some of the other settings added to this. For instance, if we're logging in from home, while Frank is at work, maybe we don't need to do MFA. If Frank is logging in from a mobile device, maybe they do MFA. If Frank has some sort of risk for signing in, then maybe ask Frank to confirm it is them and not somebody else trying to log in. So some of those options that I can drop in based on different settings in my policy. Now, I can look at some other options that are here. These are nice options to talk about. So we can build an authentication strength in our environment to suggest, hey, for a user or a service to log in into a secure resource that I have, they must be using a secure method to log in. Now, we can define the authentication strength in the conditional access main blade. We'll come back onto that later and have a look at them. Currently, I have defined a few already from the past, and I can pick from one of my predefined lists in here to say, hey, this is what I want to apply. So I can force the method of authentication that I require, which I consider more secure for this user to be able to log into this particular resource based on the policy that I'm creating. So it gives me that additional layer of security to be added onto this. And again, this is something I can use. Now, there are a few other options that you can consider, but just be very careful on when you create these policies. Things like required device to be marked as compliant. Now, I could say that, I could tick that box and say, hey, make sure that anyone that's logging in has a compliant device. Now, if in my situation, instead of Frank, I had chosen all users in my organization, and I would have said if they're logging into Office, they must have a compliant device. Now, for whatever reason, let's assume I was on a holiday for 2 weeks and I come back and I tried to log into my device. My device needed an update and I didn't update the device and I tried to log in. This will probably stop me and say, hey, hold on, your device isn't compliant, so we are not letting you log in. Should be careful on some of these settings. That's why it warns you there. Don't lock yourself out when you do this. Again, something similar to that, we also have options like required Microsoft Entra hybrid join device. Now, if I trigger this for all users, I might be in a bit of a problem. If my users are not all hybrid Entra joined, and some of them work from in Entra joined devices, some work with registered devices, or when they're not in Office, they're using their own device and their connection might not be a hybrid joined. Now, in that case, those users won't be able to log in anymore. Now, I could create a separate policy just for users that are within the office, maybe in my office building, when they are working from within the office, and if they require a hybrid joined device, maybe I don't require them to do any further authentication because I know they're within the office. So it could be something I can look into doing, but enabling this for all users might be a little bit of a problem. And again, that's why it tells me don't lock yourself out, because maybe you don't have or not everyone will have a device that's necessarily a hybrid joined device. Apart from that, there are quite a few other options. Like I said, we are going to touch on a few of them, not every single option that's in here. We can say the required approved client app. So again, if it's an app that's already approved, you can look at adding that. You can go into the list of approved apps in your clients and add some of them to the list. You could also look at app protection policies to be added into this. And finally, there is an option right over here to suggest require this user to change password. Now, again, you might be thinking, hey, why do I require this user to change password? In this case, bear with me, let's just take this option off for a minute. So it doesn't give me that warning. So let's try that again. So again, okay, I thought I just took that off. I am going to do multi-factor authentication. All right. Just do that. Okay, cool. Now, sorry, just to avoid the errors on the screen. Now, if I was to look at this, it says require password change. Now, required password change would mean Frank now logging into office.com and from anywhere in the world, any network, when Frank's logged in, Frank is going to be asked to reset password every single time. Now, this is something that you need to be careful on in terms of defining your policies and how you create them and how you define them. That would be the last thing I want to do, to ask Frank to log in, reset password every single login attempt that Frank makes to office.com. However, it could be another policy that I could create where if Frank has a user risk associated to Frank's account, which means their account is very likely compromised right now, then in that case, I would force Frank at the very next login to reset their password. And that could be something as a new policy that I can create as part of my setup. So we have some of these options available. Again, not necessarily saying we have to enable them all in one policy. Now, underneath the reset password, I have two other options over here. Now, these are defined what we refer as terms of use. And we can create these policies ourselves. We can create a terms and conditions area with another conditional access, and we can start using them as part of the policy. Maybe a user is logging into a very secure environment. Every week, every day, depending on what you consider secure, you might require this user to confirm, I have read the company policy around this data and I'm aware of what I'm doing and I'm going to go log into it. Now, this might be very, very secure data that your users are logging into, and you might want to remind them again and again about their company policy. So you could add some terms of conditions where a user is then prompted to say, hey, can you agree to the terms and conditions, confirm that you've read this policy and you understand what you're doing, Otherwise, you might be in a breach of some company policies or maybe a legislation. So you can include some of those in here. Again, you can add more to this and they will simply appear up in here, and we'll have a look at them a bit later. Now, right at the end of this, we could say require all of the selected controls. That means if I do more than one ticks in the options above, then the user going through this policy, if they match this policy, they would be asked to go through each one of those options, which sometimes is needed, other times maybe not. So you could actually change that to say require any one of the above controls. So if I'm asking them to do MFA or reset password, or maybe they should be on a joint device, then maybe we can ask them to perform one of them, not all of these actions, to be granted access into their environment. So again, for now, we will leave it as it is and we'll carry on working with that. Now, for now, what I have done is Frank logging into office.com from any network, and we'll grant access to Frank as long as Frank does MFA, and that's what we are doing so far, and we are going to select this to confirm. Now, just to add to this, let's bring in a random terms and conditions in there as well that we want to add, and we'll require all selected controls for now. So they do MFA and they agree to terms and conditions that I've created for them in this part of the setup, and I'll select that. Now, the second part of my access control brings some additional controls for me in here to implement as part of the login or as part of this policy carrying on. Now, here I can enforce certain other things. There are quite a few interesting options to explore from here. We can look at an option to say use app enforced restrictions. Now, if your app already has certain restrictions defined within the application, we can enforce those restrictions as part of that as well. Maybe you have some sort of a control built into the application and you want to ensure that when users are logging in, whatever app policies are within the app, they are enforced using conditional access. This is where you will go and trigger them off by saying, hey, look at the policies in the app and trigger them as well when the user logs in this case, when Frank logs in. So trigger that if I had any implemented. Use conditional access app control. Now, this is a very, very interesting area to look at. We'll, in this course, discuss a little bit later on another topic called Microsoft Defender for Cloud Apps. And within that, we can look at bringing in compliance and governance within our applications. And if we want to control on what people can do within an application, we can create some policies using a Defender for Cloud Apps. However, in my conditional access, I can define in here to look at just monitor everything that's going on within the cloud apps, or look at blocking downloads from them, or using a custom policy. Now here I can simply define to go and look for the custom policy that I have defined in my Defender for Cloud Apps. Now the menu here points that out for me as well, that hey, you are going to be looking at triggering this from here. However, the policy will be created in Microsoft Defender for Cloud Apps, and you'll have to go into that to manage that policy. So that would control further in terms of what the application policy or what security policies you've applied to that application. So this would now trigger from the conditional access, but the policy lives and is created in Defender for Cloud Apps. Now, apart from that, we could look into some other options like sign-in frequency, and this is where we can look at how frequently do we want the user to be signing in. Typically, there are some default details that by default, the Windows would have a rolling 90 days options already available for you, so that you don't need to sign in again and again onto that device. However, if you don't prefer that default setup, you may want to change that. How frequently do you want the user to sign in? And you can start defining that in here. And again, you can require the user to be signing in at a regular interval if that's needed for your organization. We can also look at persistent browser sessions. For instance, if the user is logged into a service, while they're on it and they close the browser and they start back again, the browser continues from where they were rather than asking them to authenticate again and start from fresh. And again, if that's something you prefer, you can create that as part of your policy to keep persistent browser session available in here. We also have another very interesting option, a continuous access evaluation option. Now, this is very, very interesting to understand that typically when a user authenticates to a resource, like we mentioned before in one of the videos, they typically get an access token and a refresh token associated to them. Now, based on that access token, they get granted access to a resource that they're working on, and that typically lasts for an hour by default. And the refresh token will go back and refresh that token again every hour to make sure they have continuous access to the resource without them having to authenticate again and again. Now, if within that time period, within that hour, something has changed, maybe we've disabled the user account, maybe something else has gone on and we have put some restrictions, some security measures, and something has changed and we want the conditional access to take certain action, then this is where it can look at using customized continuous access evaluation, where it can evaluate in real time if there was any changes to the user settings, including their access, then it could change the current use of their resource. Maybe block them, ask them to re-authenticate, sign them out, revoke their sessions, whatever that it needs to do. And again, this is where it can go and do that. Now, this could also be useful if you're looking at similar types of attacks where users can take an access token and replay them again back to your identity provider. This would be able to evaluate that to understand if this was an actual user that's trying to log in, or is this something else that's going on in here. Now, apart from that, apart from the continuous evaluation, we also have an option to disable resilience, resilience default. Now, by default, what would typically happen if a user is logged into a service and they've authenticated themselves, if there was an outage of some sort in the back and the user needs to refresh their token again after the hour has passed, instead of that token getting refreshed because the service is out, the system would automatically extend their ability to carry on working in a case of an outage. Now, if you don't want that to happen, you can disable the resilience default in here so they don't get the extended access and they have to wait to re-authenticate themselves to carry on working within that environment. So again, an option to explore over here. Now, required token protection. Earlier on, when I was talking about the continuous evaluation, I mentioned a small part saying, hey, what if there was a replay attack? Actually, the replay attack part comes into the token protection for sign-in. This is where it actually looks at making sure the token that you have is allocated to you, your device, your user, and it knows where it's going to, the expiry of it, the validity of it. So it ensures that no one else is trying to replay that token back in. And this is where it brings in that added protection to users that are working in your environments. And finally, we have options over here to create users to or allow users to use the global secure access security profiles. So when they're using or accessing their resources from anywhere in the world, either they're using it privately or using over the internet under different profiles that are available for global secure access, you can enforce these policies by using conditional access by triggering that particular option right there. For us in this demo, I'm going to leave all these options out, but good to know what these options look like and what they can be used for. For now, we'll leave this out and say okay to that. And we are going to simply come back in here and look at the last part of this policy. Now, at the very bottom of the screen, if I zoom into it, we have a few options right here. One that says enable this policy, and it says for report only. Now, if this policy is enabled under report only, that means it will not stop something from happening. For example, in this case, if Frank logs into Office 365 from any location, it would note down that it met the conditions of the policy, but it wouldn't trigger the MFA that we had as part of the policy configured. And they won't be asked to do the terms and conditions. That's where we have the grant part in there, so that it wouldn't trigger, but it would report back, Frank met condition once, and every time they go through. Now, I could enforce this policy by switching this on. So when I switch it on, then everything that I have defined under the access control will trigger on. they would have to go through all the details I've defined in my grant and session part of the policy. I could create this policy and switch it on off for now, leave it for later. Maybe at some point later I will try it out. Maybe I will start off with a selected group of people, test it out, see if it works, and then roll it out to everybody in my environment. So again, it's an option that we can choose to trigger in our environment. Now let's turn this policy on. Now before I hit create, one very important part that we haven't done yet is give a name to our policy right up there. Now let's call this SC-300 and we'll call it Pol 1. So that's my first policy for SC-300, and we'll hit create to that. And this is how you create a conditional access policy. Now, while the policy is getting effective, a couple of things to highlight from the main menu for my conditional access. A few things that are nice to see. I have some name locations right here. Now, during the creation of the policy, I mentioned different locations, trusted locations. Now, this is where I can go in and add some of the trusted locations into my environments, so I can reuse them in the policies later as locations that I have maybe good or not good, allowed, not allowed, or while you're in them, then you don't do certain security settings. So again, this is where you can bring in some of that. Again, you can bring them based on your IP address. You can base them on country locations. So you can define if traffic coming from a particular country is allowed, not allowed. You can configure them as part of your locations in your conditional access setup right over here. Now, apart from that, in my policy that we've just created, we created a terms and condition or terms of use. Now in here, like I said, you can bring in your own terms and conditions to create where you want people to be able to go through some of them. Now, they're very easy to create. For me to look at a new one, I can hit create new terms and use, give a name to this. This could be my demo terms and conditions. So we can say demo TC. I can upload a document in here. Typically, you'll upload a PDF document, and you can choose a language that you're choosing for that PDF. You can give it a display name. Maybe we can call it terms and condition, and I can call it that. Now, I could go into defining certain other options over here, saying, hey, the user is required to expand all of these options. So it's not the case that they're seeing the policy and they're just going next. We at least require them to expand different headings so we know they've read it. At least we can force them to do that. So we can ask them to do this. Require user to consent on every device. So every time they change a device, we want them to confirm this again. Expire the consent. Maybe I want them to be able to do this every week, every day, every month, every 3 months, whatever that works for you. You can do that. You can set that on and define an expiry every time they consent to it. Every 90 days, this expires. So you can ask them to do that as part of this setup, or simply a duration before re-acceptance required. So you can simply go and define that in here, a number of days after when they need to re-accept this. And I can trigger this directly into one of my existing policies that we've created. Or I can say, hey, create this and I'll add this to my policy later. And this will then appear up in the list of policies that we have. Now, just for now, we'll leave this out and we'll come back out of terms of use. And this is where we can introduce more terms of use in our environment. Now, earlier on within the policies, we had some options to look at authentication strengths. If I go into creating a new authentication strength, this is where I can start creating a name for it. I can give it a name. Maybe this is for my particular HR application or my finance team. They need to do certain particular authentication methods that I prefer more secure. And I can come back in here and define what does that look like for me. Do they need to be on Windows Hello? Do they need to use FIDO keys for them? Again, given that they have those registered in their user accounts and they can use them. So I can pick and choose whatever I consider a secure strength of a resource, and I can define them as here. And using the conditional access policies, I can trigger them out in terms of if you are using this device and logging into this secure app, accessing this data, you must authenticate with secure methods. So if your initial access was just Windows Hello, we also want you to do Windows Hello and a FIDO key, or Windows Hello and something else along with that to make sure you are logging in securely. Now, apart from that, if we jump back onto the policy very quickly, the policy is now up and running. Just before we go into the policies, a few other pointers for everyone to look at. If you're very, very new to working with conditional access policies, Microsoft has created some templates for you to look at. So if you don't know how to go and configure all these menus that I went through with you, you can go into creating a policy from an existing template. There are different categories you can pick from. You can simply go into picking one of these and creating a policy with that, and then going into the policy definition to see exactly what's been defined and how they've defined it, which might help you understand how policies can work. Maybe you can start tweaking it, try it on read-only to see if it works. So this is a very, very nice area for you to look at if you are looking or starting fresh into conditional access policies and you want to get an idea on how to create conditional access policies. Now, you can bring your own policies in if you already have them available. You can simply upload these policies here if you needed to. And again, you could have them in different repositories. If you're bringing them in here to implement, by all means do. Finally, we have a very, very amazing feature over here called What If. This is a very nice troubleshooting feature that's available within your conditional access. If you want to find out what is going on with your setup, and if somebody is getting blocked by getting access to a resource or a service or a device, maybe you can go back and check if there's a policy that's triggering that, or if they are, or if they should be configured under a policy and they should be required to do MFA or something else, and they're not. Maybe you can come back and check if that policy is actually triggered for them or is defined appropriately that captures all the right users in them. You can come back in here and check. Now, as a very, very quick check, if, for example, we go in here and say, hey, let's select a user. And let's go and say, if I go and pick up Frank from the list and say Frank and suggest, I want to see if Frank logs into Cloud Apps. For now, let's see if I can get away without choosing a particular app. I think it's going to make me choose one. And let's say if Frank is logging in from a Windows device and they are going into using a browser and they're trying to log in. Now, let's leave the rest of the details blank for now, and let's hit What If. Now, when I try this, ideally it should come back. This is requiring an app. Let's try that. Let's drop in the app in here, and let's pick up the Office app that we defined earlier on. So if I say, hey, Frank's going to log into the Office portal. Now, let's try what happens. And let's try Water one more time. Now, this is where it will start checking out for you if there are any policies that will trigger for Frank, and if in that case you would know how many policies are effective with the settings that you defined. Now, I can be more descriptive and go into choosing a particular network, particular country, and all the other options that I have in here to make sure I define the right details to see this. Now, right at the bottom of my screen, I apologize, I see it's a bit small, but I can see that the policy that we just created called SC-300 Pol 1 is right at the bottom of the screen. So that means Frank will be hitting with this, this policy will be hitting Frank when Frank logs in to the Office environment that we have. And again, it says require multi-factor authentication and the terms and conditions that I've added for Frank. And this currently is in an on state, and that will hit Frank when Frank logs in. I could also check policies that don't apply to Frank, and maybe I have a policy that should be hitting Frank, but I can go back and check why not, and again I can go back and see if I need to tweak my policies a little bit. So this becomes a very, very interesting tool if you want to troubleshoot loads of different types of issues of why somebody's getting blocked, or why is the policy not targeting a particular resource or user if you had created a policy for them in this case. So again, a brilliant tool to look at. I hope that's given you a good understanding of how to create conditional access policies and configure different parts of conditional access policies, including if you're just a new starter using templates and trying to use What If to troubleshoot them. With that, we come to the end of the session. We encourage you to review the reference modules, check your knowledge with the additional study materials, watch other videos in this course, or search out your next favorite topic on Microsoft Learn at aka.ms/learn. Thanks for watching and see you in the next video.